Hi folks, Wooden Boat Dan here. Just wanted to give you a heads up. The podcast you're about to listen to was recorded several years ago, so some of the phone numbers, email addresses, website links, and time-sensitive information are no longer valid. Please keep that in mind as you listen. If you'd like to contact me, my email address is woodenboatdan@gmail.com. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. You are listening to Hooked on Wooden Boats weekly podcast episode number 87. I'm your host, Dan Matson, aka Wooden Boat Dan. If you can't do it, well, there's probably nobody that can, unless they're super talented. And this is the world's first podcast fully dedicated to celebrating the art, craft, history, tradition, and romance of wooden vessels all over the world. Thanks for tuning in today. We're going to have a lot of fun as usual. I'm super stoked about some things that I'm going to tell you about here in a minute. Doesn't get any better than this, folks. The wooden boat world is rocking and rolling. Today's featured segment is an interview with Doug Hylan. Doug has a boat shop in Brooklin, Maine, Hylan Associates. He's been designing and building boats for years. In fact, one of his designs is in the current issue of Wooden Boat magazine. If you look at May-June 2013, issue number 232, and you go to page 94, Doug has a 29-foot motorboat that he designed there called the Marsh Hen. Really cool boat. So I am super stoked to play this interview with Doug. And the cool thing about it is this is the first phone interview that I've recorded. I finally quit procrastinating and got my equipment set up that I'd purchased a year ago to do remote interviews. Yeah, up till now I've done everything in person. And I really enjoy meeting people in person and doing interviews that way, but by doing phone interviews, that opens up my universe to basically anybody in the world. So I've got a little mixer set up, and I've got a USB external sound card, and I've got my digital audio recorder, and I've got a mix minus set up, if you know what that is, so that when I call people from my Skype account, I can call them on their landline or their cell phone and do a good recording. The recording with Doug, there were a couple times where the phone sounded kind of weird. I'm going to edit that out, but I don't think you'll notice it. It came out very good. So I'm super stoked about doing these remote interviews from Skype from my home computer. So you're going to be hearing from folks hopefully all over the world here on my regular podcasting, which is pretty fun. Well, there's lots of highlights this week. That's one of them, is doing the remote phone interviews. Another one is I got cranking again on my canoe, and today I'm going to put the third coat of varnish on, and am planning on 5 or 6 coats, one a day. And then this Sunday, depending upon weather and if I have the boat done, which I'm 99% sure, we're actually going to have a little launching party at Lake Kai in Snohomish County in Arlington. Have some family and friends over and take the boat down and launch it. And my son Josh is going to shoot a little video of that, which I'm going to share with the Hooked on Wooden Boat community. So I'm super stoked about that. Finally finishing that boat. Yeah, I think I started it either January or February of last year. Initially, I thought I would have it done in May of last year, and then I thought, June, and then September, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it's going to be done here in a few days, folks, and it's looking really good. It's a very pretty canoe. The mahogany gunnels on it came out absolutely gorgeous, and I've got to thank my friend Trevor Gimmer, who people give me wood because they know I build boats, and so they'll just give me random things, and Trevor gave me some pieces of mahogany. I believe it's Honduran mahogany that were like 1 by 2 or 1 by 3 inches and 12 to 15 feet long. Just rough cut stuff. And man, I took those things and shaped them and sanded them, and they've got some absolutely gorgeous patterns in them, which really highlight the gunnels of the boat in a really cool way. So anyway, I'm super stoked about that, and I'll be sharing that video hopefully in the next week or two of that launching. And then the other thing I'm super stoked about is I ordered my scamp kit. Hee-haw! Wow, I can't believe it. I ordered it yesterday from Josh Colvin at Small Craft Advisor magazine, and I'll be picking up the kit probably next week. Ordered the boat and the foils kit. And my plan at this point, and this could change, could evolve, is that I will build the scamp. I will basically assemble the kit and epoxy coat everything and then sell the boat in that assembled order so that somebody would then purchase it. They would add their sails and spars. They could paint or varnish the boat, customize it the way they want it, buy a trailer for it, and those sort of things. So that's a plan right now. That could evolve. And I'm thinking of a price for the boat when I finish with it of around $6,000. Now, that's not a firm price yet, but that's just kind of in my head. I've talked to a few people that may be in the ballpark. We'll see how long it takes me to build. My goal is to have it done by July, late July or mid-August, right in there. So I'm super stoked. If you have any interest in purchasing a scamp that's basically assembled that you can finish yourself, shoot me an email, dan@hookedonwoodenboats.com. So I'm super stoked about the scamp. I can't wait to dig in. I've been reading through the 100-page manual, which at times feels a little overwhelming, and then I just back up and I go, okay, it's just one step at a time. I've built boats before. I can do this, and I'm going to end up with a really nice boat when I'm done. Anyway, I'm super excited. And you may be asking, why would I build a boat and sell it? Well, for one thing, my consulting work is slowed down right now, and I could use the money, make a little bit of money, not a whole lot, but a little bit on that. It gives me some experience, gets me immersed more in the scamp world, and hopefully the boat after that, then I would build my own scamp and keep it. We'll see. But anyway, this gets me in the game, which I'm super stoked about. Okay, we've got some new subscribers to the e-newsletter this week. David Dixon, Vernon Fuller, Ben Siebens, and Carl Obermeyer. Thanks for signing up for the newsletter, guys. I appreciate it. For those of you that haven't signed up, you need to do it right now. So get on your smartphone or on your computer and go to hookedonwoodenboats.com/subscribe. Give me your first and last name and your email address, and you'll get my monthly newsletter, which I'll be sending out this week. It's just a way for me to connect with people, give you updates on what I'm up to, what's happening with Hooked on Wooden Boats. And the other thing I'm going to start using it for is letting people know when I'm going to be at events, wooden boat events, and in certain locations. And if they're going to be in the area, we can hook up. Case in point is last week on Friday, I sent out an email to my newsletter list and said, hey, I'm going to be in Olympia at the Wooden Boat Fair on Saturday. If you can make it, shoot me an email or give me a phone call. And I had several phone calls and emails and actually hooked up with Masaki Tabahashi, who's a student at the Northwest School of Wooden Boat Building in Port Hadlock. He drove down and met me, and we hung out. And then met a couple other guys there, Tom Pearson, who was on the Sandman tugboat. Hung out with him a little bit. And then Greg Gilbert, who was on the motor boat Winifred, which is a Lake Union dream boat, really cool boat. Got to hang out with him a little bit. And then it was a cool thing. Other people that couldn't make it did send me an email. So that's the other thing I use the newsletter subscription list for. So if you haven't already signed up, please do so. The Olympia Wooden Boat Fair that I went to last Saturday was a lot of fun. I had gone to it last year for the first time. I got a very warm welcome from Megan Juritz, who's the fair coordinator. She actually sent me a list of boats beforehand that I could kind of look over and check out. There's about 45 boats there, power, sail, Cool thing about it is there's a few boats there that I used to see on the Columbia River as a kid, motor boats like Fairliner, Tollycraft, and Chris-Craft, wooden yachts in the 26 to 32 foot range, which is what we used to have a 1961 Chris-Craft Constellation, 28 foot with twin Chevy 283s. We used to run around the river on that. That was my dad's boat, and we'd see the Fairliners and Tollies and stuff like that. So that's always fun. It just brings back great memories of hanging out on the river, the river. So yeah, I would encourage you to check out the Olympia Wooden Boat Festival next year. If you didn't make it this year, it's always on Mother's Day weekend, Saturday and Sunday. The other really cool boat I saw there that I used to see on the river too was a Thompson ski boat. It's a little runabout, about 16 feet long. It's lap strake. It's got a real flared bow. And there was one at the fair that was absolutely gorgeous. The hull was painted a kind of a pale yellow, and it was varnished interior, and it had some really retro-looking seats. In fact, if you go to facebook.com/woodenboatdan, there's a couple pictures on there of that boat. I didn't get to meet the owners because they weren't there when I went by, but I got some great pictures, and I'm going to try to get more information about that boat because I would like to probably include that on my 2014 Hooked on Wooden Boats calendar that I'm going to be producing this year. So anyway, the fair was a lot of fun. I would encourage you to make it next year if you can. I'm slowly tweaking my website with a few changes. One of the things I've done is on my homepage, hookedonwoodenboats.com, on the top right there below the banner, there's a Facebook banner there, which makes it very easy for you to like me on Facebook, Wooden Boat Dan. So I would encourage you to do that if you haven't already. Okay, we're going to move on to the interview with Doug Hylan. I had a great chat with Doug over the phone, called him from my Skype and did a recording. Hope you enjoy this interview, so take it away, Doug. Okay, it is May 10th, 2013. I am on the phone with Doug Hylan from Brooklin, Maine. Doug, welcome to the podcast.
Well, good to be here.
Yeah, great to have you on board for the podcast. As I mentioned to you a couple minutes ago, this is the first phone interview I've done, which is pretty exciting because it opens up a whole new world of podcast interviewees for myself and for my listeners, which is pretty sweet. So, Doug, you've got a boat shop there in Brooklin, Maine, and doing all kinds of cool stuff there. Before we get to that, could you just give me a little brief history, personal history of yourself, where you're from, and what you kind of did growing up?
Well, I grew up in a suburb north of Boston with a little lake in it, which had a lot of allure for me. And it was a sort of a typical baby boom suburban upbringing. Big families, lots of kids in the neighborhood, lots of kids that were more or less, by today's standards, allowed to run free and do whatever they did as long as they came home for dinner each night. And one of the things that I was fascinated in was boats, and my father and older brother had started a little skiff, and I don't even know how long it was. I suspect the plans came from something like Popular Mechanics, or it was one of those little skiffs that was supposed to do everything, sail and row and take an outboard motor. And my brother was interested in the motoring part, and so he and my father started that boat. But it became evident pretty soon that my brother was never going to be able to amass the fortune necessary to buy a motor. And so he lost interest in the project, and I took it from there and built a sailing rig for it, and he stitched up a sail out of some fabric we found at the dump. And
I love it.
And it sailed, and I learned to sail. I had a buddy who'd been away to summer camp and knew a little bit about sailing. He taught me what he knew, and we used to go out on the lake and sail around. And to my recollection, there was never a life jacket anywhere in seen the things. And my mother knew fully well that I couldn't swim.
Oh, really?
But anyway, we just went out and did it. That was what we did in those days. There were plenty of kids. I guess you could afford to lose one or two without too much worry. And then as adolescence started to hit, I was looking also probably through a Popular Mechanics and saw plans for a catamaran. Oh, man, I was ready for that. And somehow I built the thing in the cellar. My father was not interested in boats at all. Nobody else in the family particularly was. So I built that thing and somehow got it out, and it was a disappointing design. But anyway, we went sailing in that for a few years. And then I went to college and dallied around in biochemistry and hippie homesteading for a few years, and then moved to Maine. And when I moved to Brooklyn, I took a winter job with a house builder here in town named Jimmy Steele, who had a sideline of building these nice, beautifully built little traditionally built, plank on frame peapods, which is
little double ender.
Yes, a peapod is an indigenous lobstering boat from the days before horsepower. People could actually earn a living tending enough traps in a rowing and sailing boat to hold themselves together, and they quite often did it in peapods. Anyway, he built a few of these every winter, somewhat as for his own recreation. He would have been the first to tell you that he never made much money building them. But I was working in the shop in the winters, and alongside, he didn't like anyone else to actually work on these boats unless it came to a sailing rig, and he had no use for making a sailing rig. So if somebody ordered a sailing rig, I would be allowed to make the spars and the rudder and that sort of thing.
Oh, really? Okay.
But anyway, that got me reignited in the boating interest. And a few years later, I took a job with Joel White, spent a couple winters with him, and then started a partnership with another fellow in Benjamin River Marine, which was a storage and maintenance yard primarily, but we did a lot of restoration and a little bit of new construction work there. And then in about, when was it, 98 or something like that, I split off on my own and have had this shop since then.
Yeah. So what drew you to Brooklin, Maine originally, moving up from Boston?
Well, we first moved to Belgrade, which is inland, because real estate there was cheap, and that was my hippie homesteader stage, and getting some cheap land was a priority. Then I had a neighbor there who was interested in doing a boat building project, and we looked through. Wooden Boat had just started up not too long before, and they had a little plans catalog, and we looked through their plans catalog, and our eyes came to rest on this Nelson Zimmer Mackinac boat, which is a 18-foot kind of heavy, a workboat type. Sort of a shrunk-down version of what apparently was like the pickup truck of the Great Lakes during the late 1800s. And we decided we were going to build that, but we perhaps ought to go to Wooden Boat. And I don't know why I thought we had to do that. I couldn't just order the plans through the mail. But anyway, we went to the offices here in Brooklin, Maine, and to look at the plans and to ask if they had names of people who had built the boat previously that we might be able to talk to. And I saw Brooklyn, and it was, I kind of liked the looks of it. We'd been thinking about moving to the coast, and there was a building here that took my eye that we eventually wound up owning, and that's how we got here in Brooklyn.
Wow, interesting. So, Doug, I wanted to ask about that very first boat that you helped your brother and dad build. What kind of boat was that? What size and construction and all that? Do you remember?
I don't remember a lot of the details. The hull was mostly completed when I came on the scene.
Okay. Was it a plywood boat or was it?
Yeah, it was a plywood boat.
Okay.
And I suspect it was flat-bottomed or maybe a very slight V-bottom.
Was it a pram? pram bow, or?
No, it had
No.
a pointy bow, but
Okay.
I'm guessing it was 10 feet. It might have been 12, but it seemed like 12 to me, but that probably means it was more like 10.
Yeah. You had a single sail rig on it?
Yep.
Uh-huh.
Just a very simple little Marconi cat rig. And that was what I did, was made the mast and boom and rudder and centerboard and that stuff.
Oh, I see. Okay. Very cool.
We didn't put the centerboard in at first, thinking that it was probably a daggerboard, now that I think of it.
Okay.
And thinking we weren't quite sure what that was needed for anyway. So we went out for our first sail and blew down to the leeward side of the lake and had to walk home.
Oh, really? Oh, that's funny. That's hilarious. And then the catamaran you built, what about that boat? Do you remember some details on that?
Well, that was also plywood.
Okay.
And sort of tortured plywood, what we'd call tortured plywood today. They hadn't invented the term at that time. It wasn't a successful boat, both from a design point of view and from, I was still lacking in money and couldn't afford real turnbuckles. So I'd go to the hardware store and buy turnbuckles that looked big enough to me, but they didn't have the eyes welded shut on them. They would open up. The eyes on the ends would open up under stress. So you'd just get tearing along, and those things would open up, and the mast would go over the side. It was usually landed on something.
Oh, my goodness.
So unfortunate. Anyway, and then once, when you did get it really going, the leeward hull would submarine on you. Before it ever really planed.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Now, did you design that boat?
No.
Okay.
It was a design. I've come across the design since then. It's still, I think, for sale.
Really?
But I wouldn't recommend it to anyone.
Oh, that's hilarious. So the other, you mentioned Joel White, that you worked with him for a while. So for our listeners that don't know who that is, tell us a little bit about Joel, if you would.
Well, Joel was the son of the great writer E.B. White, and he went to school at MIT in naval architecture. And I think he may have been caught up in the Korean War as well. He spent a spell in the Army, I believe. And when he got done with that, and I should be careful to note here that I'm not really sure on a lot of this history, so you should take it for a grain of salt.
Yeah.
But when he came back home, he decided he wanted to go into the boatbuilding business. And he partnered up with Arno Day, who is a locally somewhat famous lobster boat builder. And they built a few boats together down at Center Harbor, which is sort of the main harbor here in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. And then later, Arno Day went off by himself, and Joel took over the business. And it was primarily a storage and maintenance business. But Joe would occasionally build some boats. He'd finish off lobster boats, both fiberglass and wooden, for local fishermen, and build an occasional yacht. And I really have to credit Joel, as much as Wooden Boat Magazine, probably, with perhaps you could say the rebirth of the wooden boat movement, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
Because he not only sort of maintained the flame of techniques, which were dying out in most of the rest of the country. Maine was a backwater then as now, and there were still people building wooden boats here, work boats, lobster boats primarily. But Joel really kept together a fleet of yachts for the local yacht club. There was a little yacht club here. There is a little yacht club here in Brooklyn. And he maintained a lot of those old boats and sort of, I guess you could say in a way, forestalled what might be considered inevitable in most yacht clubs, where owners, once their wooden boats started to give out, they'd get fiberglass ones. Well, he kept the wooden boat ones, kept them up in good shape, and made it viable for them to keep those boats. And so there was a big fleet of 12.5s and Beetle Cats and larger boats, some Herreshoffs and Concordia Yawls and Augie Nielsen boats, and a lot of real classic wooden boats were stored there and maintained by him in a very knowledgeable fashion and repaired by him. So he was, in addition to being just a terrific guy, he was really very instrumental in providing knowledge and material. He was a good writer, an excellent craftsman. He wrote a lot of the early wooden boat material and provided information for a lot that he didn't. And he provided a place where younger boat builders could go and learn the trade.
Interesting. So he really kind of kept things alive back there with the wooden boats that were working out there in the harbor, huh?
He did. Not just from a workboat point of view, because there were several workboat builders in wood. The Days, both Arno Day and his brother June Day, were building wooden workboats really right up until June Day died, which was, probably about 2000. He was building wooden workboats. But Joe really approached it from a more worldly point of view, as a much more part of a big picture.
Interesting. Very cool. Well, we talked about through email about a topic that we would discuss here on the podcast about what makes a traditional boat long-lasting. And, you kind of threw out some terms, design and engineering, construction materials and methods, owner satisfaction and maintenance, pedigree and provenance, which, by the way, I had to look up provenance. I didn't know what that meant.
Well, you haven't been watching Antiques Roadshow, clearly.
No, I guess not. The place or
My
source.
My wife's a big fan, so I
really?
hear about provenance
Okay,
all the time.
very cool, very cool. So let's talk about that, Doug. What makes a traditional boat long-lasting?
Over the years, we've done a number of restorations on older boats, sometimes quite old boats. And so it's very, it might not be as much fun as building a new boat, but it's much more instructive on what things work and what things don't work, what things really you need to pay attention to, and what things you can kind of let slide a little bit. Because a lot of these boats were, approaching 100 years in age, which is pretty good life. There's nothing else, with the exception of perhaps some wrought iron vessels that have lasted that long.
Mm-hmm.
So they're really worth studying and worth giving some thought to and worth trying to understand. And Wooden Boat did an article a number of years ago on what makes a boat last and stick around, stay with us. And they covered a number of these things. But they're worth rehashing a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe we should start with the boat should just be beautiful. The more beautiful it is, the more devotion it attracts from its owners, and the more respect, and the more they're willing to pass it on to another good owner, and willing to spend the money that it takes to maintain it. So that's an important thing. You find very few ugly boats that last that long.
Yeah, interesting. So maybe a corollary to that would be an old Corvette that's got that's really cool. And,
yeah, sure.
Versus a Chevy Vega that or
those
something.
disappeared before the paint was dry.
Yeah,
I haven't even seen one of those in a museum. Anyway, but yes, that's a good.
Okay, yeah. So beauty has a big impact on how
I think it
the
really
owner.
has a much bigger impact than people are often willing to admit.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a bunch of other things, of course, that are involved. A good history of racing, will make a boat more valuable for people in the future and make the owners more willing to, especially if it's a long history of racing, because racing boats tend to become obsolete very quickly. But if they stay competitive over a length of time, then they clearly have something special.
Yeah, right.
Worth preserving.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes them maybe more valuable to the family that owns them. They've got some great times to remember in those boats, some great racing together, and they really, cherish those times.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But then in the looking back at these boats that we've seen, they sort of fit that mold. They're good looking. They've been successful boats. But over and above that, there are lots of good-looking, successful boats that have passed by the wayside. Then you start having to look at things like design, and I don't mean so much design from a point of view of aesthetics or hydrostatics, but more in the realm of engineering. How well was the engineering of that boat done? And how well was the construction of it? How knowledgeably was the construction done? And to a lesser extent, what kind of materials went into the boat?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when you start looking at those boats, all of a sudden, NG Herreshoff boats start really sticking out.
Mm-hmm.
And most of these really old boats that we've dealt with have been NG Herreshoff boats. It's worth mentioning, people may not know that there are, almost everyone has heard the name Herreshoff or Herreshoff, depending on your school of thought and how it should be pronounced.
Right.
I guess now most people are saying Herreshoff, but I'm so far north that I'm hoping that I can get away with using the old pronunciation.
Yeah.
Anyway, there were primarily two Herreshoffs in the yachting world, N.G. Herreshoff, Nathaniel Green, who was the father, and then his son, L. Francis Herreshoff, who was also a great designer in his own right. But the difference between them is that virtually every boat the old man designed was built in his own factory, Herreshoff Manufacturing Company, down in Bristol, Rhode Island, where he kept very close watch over the construction process in all these boats. He would visit, even though he was primarily designing at that time, he went to the shops every day and talked to the foreman and looked over the work that was being done. He kept a very close eye on things. And so the craftsmanship on those boats was excellent, and the materials were excellent, and they were consistent over the years. Whereas his son, L. Francis's designs were built, by the time his son was really in his heyday, Herreshoff Manufacturing had gone into bankruptcy and closed its doors. So the son had to have his boats built, by various builders around in various places. And some of those were good and some weren't. The boats, over and above the design of the boats, the construction was variable and the materials were variable. So the boats that you see that have really stood the test of time have been the father's boats, oddly enough.
Interesting. There's a lot more quality control involved, it sounds like.
There's more quality control involved, but I'm also going to make the pitch that the engineering in N.G. Herreshoff's boats was probably about the best that there was. He was a genius. There's just no other word for it. And had many facets to this genius. And one that I find interesting is that his boats were light. The scantlings on them were light. In other words, the size of frames, the planking, the decking, all those things were light. And I think he did this partially because, or perhaps largely because, lighter boats tend to sail a little faster. And he was basically designing and building racing class boats through most of his career. Mm-hmm. And lightness also saves money. You know, if a boat is lighter, it's a little bit cheaper to build. So, and he was, you know, in a very competitive market. There were lots of other builders around. So he had to compete that way. And it's interesting that you know, my observations have been that the less wood a boat has in it, the longer it's likely to live. If, of course, it has to have enough wood in it to be strong enough so it doesn't fall apart.
Yeah.
And he pushed that limit. And in a lot of his designs, you know, some of them were too lightly built, but
really?
Not many.
Interesting.
Not many.
So was he trying to use lighter material also, or was he just using what was standardly available there in that area?
Well, the standard boat building woods here in the East were white oak for framing, and that's pretty much universally what he used. That's a fairly heavy wood.
Yeah.
And then for planking, for small boats, he would use Atlantic cedar, which is a fairly lightweight boat. But for the bigger boats, he would use either Douglas fir or longleaf yellow pine for the outer planking, and the inner planking was typically cedar or cypress, both of which are kind of light woods. And double planking was a standard procedure for him on larger boats, and that's one of the reasons that these boats have lasted so long, is that double planking just produces a stiffer hull, one that moves less, and so puts less stress on all the fastenings.
So were both layers of planks were Carvel? They were Carvel planked?
That's right, yeah.
One on top of the other?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, that was... it makes the boats much harder to repair because you go inside and you fasten back through the inner planking into the outer planking. And so anytime you want to take a plank off the outside of the boat, you have to get at the inside and remove all those fastenings as well. So it does make them more difficult to repair, but it has made them last longer. They hold their shape better. And they tended to have smoother top sides and didn't show seams nearly as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would think go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's right. I was going to ask, with double planking, I mean, that's going to add weight to a boat, but is he using thinner planks maybe, or? Yes.
The total planking thickness was the same.
Oh, really?
It would have been with single planking, just two thinner layers. The outer layer is generally about 60% of the thickness, and the inner layer about 40.
So were his boats like 3/4 of an inch thick, or an inch with two planks?
Well, they varied, of course, according to the size. They built the biggest wooden boats he built were, I'm guessing, in the probably 60-foot range. The New York 50s, although those are bigger. New York 50s were the biggest wooden boats he built, and they were 50 feet on the waterline, had pretty good overhang, so they were a much bigger boat. But when he got bigger than that, he switched to steel, which was or metal, some other metal. Mm-hmm. Another sign that he really understood the engineering, because at that point, when you get to that size, wood just cannot do it any longer in the long term,
Yeah.
You can build big wooden ships, but it's almost impossible for them to keep their shape.
Right.
Anyway, the planking was more or less standard thickness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you work on a lot of NG Herreshoff boats these days, or some, or?
We work on them occasionally. Whenever one comes our way, we did a recent restoration of a boat named Aida, which belonged to marine historian Maynard Bray. He was in the Bray family for 40 years, and she was in a very original condition and looked beautiful when she came into the shop in a way, but she had some problems. She had been built late in the in the Herreshoff manufacturing career or period when they were starting to economize with iron fastenings down in the bilge, and that it caused, as you can expect, problems. Iron fastenings is pretty much a death knell for or death sentence, I should say, for a boat. And that was another thing that Herreshoff did, was almost universally, at least while he was working there, they almost universally always used bronze fastenings.
Oh, really? So the steel fastenings cause rot around the fastener, is that right?
Well, the fastenings themselves rust, and they cause degradation of the wood around the fastening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you sometimes saw that once the Depression got started, and even a little bit before that, builders would, because a lot of the metal in a boat is down in the keel, in bolts between the floor timbers and the keel, and ballast keel bolts and things like that. That adds up money-wise. So that when they economize, they'd sometimes use iron down there.
I see. What size boat was Maynard's? The Ida, you say?
Aida.
Named
as the opera version.
Okay.
It was, I think, 33 and change. It was a later N.G. Herreshoff design, really a cruising boat, not a racing boat, a keel centerboarder, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
Had a big hunk of lead down there, but also was pretty shallow draft.
Sloop rig or?
Yawl rigged.
Yawl rig, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so he built some sloops too, though, right? Or?
Yeah, a lot of sloops, because sloops tend to be faster. And he was, most of his career, he was designing racing boats, really.
Mm-hmm.
So, he mostly designs mostly gas sloops. At that period, Marconi rigs hadn't really made much of an appearance, and when they did, he never really embraced them. He pretty much stuck with gas. That's one of the things. He was a pretty old guy by the time Marconi rig was coming into favor. He just never made the switch.
Yeah, so both NG and L. Francis are gone, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But the Herreshoff company is still alive.
Well, not as it was.
Some semblance of it, huh?
There was another son, and I really neglected to mention him, but Sidney Herreshoff was L. Francis's older brother, I believe. And Sidney really held the Herreshoff manufacturing company together after his father retired, and when times were starting to get tough. He was a very good designer in his own right. Did a lot of experimental designs with little development classes and things like that, and tried desperately to keep the Herreshoff manufacturing company afloat, but ultimately wasn't successful.
I see.
Anyway, Sidney's son is Halsey Herreshoff, who still designs boats, started and ran for many years the Herreshoff Marine Museum down in Bristol, which is on the site of Herreshoff Manufacturing Company, the old company. And they have a nice collection down there of old Herreshoff boats. But it's when you go there today, it's very hard to get a feeling for what that company was like. It was a big operation. They turned out a lot of boats.
Yeah. Do you know when that company was started, roughly? Was it like 1900 or?
More like I would guess mid-1880s.
Oh, wow.
And they started out mostly in steam yachts. N.G. Herreshoff went to MIT and studied steam engineering there. And when he got out, he had an older brother named John Brown Herreshoff, who was really the business genius behind the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company. I think it's fair to say that the company never would have been what it became without the older brother there running the business.
Interesting.
Clearly, the younger brother was the engineering and design genius, but I don't think he had much of a head or an interest for business. His older brother really was really made it a business.
Yeah.
Anyway, how did I get off onto that subject?
That didn't happen.
He was a boat builder. John Brown Herreshoff was a boat builder. The whole family was. It was quite a remarkable family. And but he went blind at a very young age. And he asked NG to come back and help him in the company, and he did. And when they first started, it was mostly designed around steam yachts. And NG Herreshoff would design pretty advanced steam engines, and they would build them right there at the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company. Lots and lots of different designs. It'd be very interesting to have someone sort of rebuild some of those old steam designs.
Wow.
But then there was a boiler explosion on one of his boats, and my understanding is that NG lost his steam engineering license.
Really?
And as a result, he went ahead and both feet, I guess you'd say, into sailing yachts. And the rest is history. He designed every America's Cup Defender for the next, I don't know how many years.
Wow.
And still do a lot of them.
So, Doug, you do some boat designing now, is that right?
Yes, I do. That's mostly what I do now. But I have a young, new, vigorous partner with better knees than mine, and he takes care of most of the work in the shop and that sort of thing. And I'm graduated to the office where I mostly do design work.
Yeah. So, what elements of NG Herreshoff's designs do you incorporate into your boats?
Well, like I say, I've done a fair amount of studying of the engineering really behind his boats, which is largely a matter of scantlings and some other things that he did in particular. But I try to learn from the lightness of his construction. Like I say, I think it makes a longer-lived boat. When you look at other historically significant boats, and take an extreme, the boats that they used to take up into the Arctic and Antarctic, which were massively heavily built.
Yeah.
Those boats were incredibly short-lived. They were, in spite of spending a good part of their career in very cold waters, they just did not last. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have these very, very lightly built Herreshoff boats, which did last and have lasted. And there are certainly a lot of other factors involved there, but lightness of construction, I think, is an important one.
So is a tendency for a lot of designers or home designers, I guess there is such a thing, to kind of overbuild frames and planks and things like that?
Not so much designers as builders.
Mm-hmm.
If you read some of L. Francis Herreshoff's writing, and he was a very good writer and developed an incredible following later in his career, he was always cautioning people to build these things just the way I've drawn them, because he knew darn well that it's an almost irresistible urge among builders to make things heavier than they're drawn on the plans.
Well, you just want it to be stronger, right, and last longer.
Well, that's the thinking. Yeah, it's going to be stronger to last longer. But my point, I guess, the point I'm trying to make is that that's not the case. A designer spends a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how big each piece of a boat needs to be, and to just do its job and not be extra weight that you're carrying around.
Right.
And no one knows really what the forces are on a hull as it's sailing especially in a big seaway. There are a lot of forces and waves coming from all different angles, wind gusting. There's all kinds of things happening to the structure of a boat that are pretty much impossible to quantify in any meaningful fashion. But that's the aim of the designer, is to make it strong enough but not too heavy.
Yeah, right. So, Doug, do you have one or two or three designs that are your most popular?
Well, of my own designs?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, early on in my career, I was inspired by Jimmy Steele's peapods to design one of my own using glued lap straight plywood. Joe White had designed what are now famous nutshell prams, which I don't know if he invented that construction technique, but he certainly popularized it. And he may well have invented it. Basically, it's the plywood boats, lap straight plywood boats, but instead of frames and rivets and all that, you use epoxy glue to glue the seams together.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful technique for small boats because there's no frames. They're easy to maintain. They're relatively easy to build. They don't leak, and they tend to be light. So they have a lot of things going for them. And the nutshell prams, I built 2 or 3 of those actually early on. And it was an eye-opener to see those boats and how light and tight and like I say, relatively easy to build and relatively easy to maintain they were. And so I decided to make a peapod with the same construction method. And that really, I think, was pretty much my first design.
Mm-hmm.
And Wooden Boat took the design and they sell it through their plans catalog. And then about the same time, we needed a yard skiff for our boatyard, and I designed a Garvey, which Wooden Boat also carries. The plans for that, and that's been a fairly popular design. It's easy to build and does well with low horsepower and has a lot of capacity. You can pile a ton of people and gear into it and go off fishing or use it as a little harbor tug or delivery boat or whatever. It's a pretty good little all-around outboard boat.
Yeah.
Those are probably most, historically speaking, the most popular designs.
Mm-hmm.
And been around for a while.
And the peapod, you can set that up for sailing too, is that right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can. And it sails fairly well. It's not primarily, peapods are primarily a rowing boat, but they sail well enough.
Yeah. What kind of rig does it have?
Well, the plans show 2 rigs. One is a sprit sail and the other a little standing lug.
I see. Okay. If I was just a little smarter, I'd have memorized all the rigs and know exactly what you meant by that, but I'm still learning all these.
They each have their advantages. And a small boat like that, one that's, again, primarily a rowing boat,
yeah,
you want the spars to all be able to fit inside the boat when it's take the rig down. You don't want some long, great spar sticking out over the end.
Yeah.
So that's a design criteria, and some of those old, really sort of workboat rigs work well that way. They're quick and cheap to put together and to put up and take down. You can roll them up and store them in a small space, and they fit inside the boat.
Very cool. Very cool. So, Doug, I'm working on an ebook that's going to be addressed to first-time boat builders, helping them work through the process of deciding what to build, what length to build, how long it's going to take them, what it's going to cost, what construction method and all that type of thing. Would you have any words of advice, just briefly, for a new-time boat builder?
Oh, I do.
Okay.
I do, because boat building projects are bigger than you think.
Okay.
And a lot of people tend to bite off way more than they can chew. And there have been a lot of divorces caused by boats that have, it seems like guys get this faraway look in their eyes and decide they're going to build some boat that's really a huge project. And it consumes their life, and part of what's consumed is their marriage, and that's really too bad.
Yeah.
So start small. That's my first advice.
Okay.
Do a really simple practice boat first, something, maybe a dinghy or something like that. The nutshell pram is an excellent little boat. For the size, I don't think there's any better boat than that little nutshell pram.
Is that an 8-foot boat?
It's made with 8 8-foot plywood, so it's a little bit less than 8 foot.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And it's on the small side. There's no doubt about that. But for a boat of that size, I think it's about the best one that I've ever used.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it goes together very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've got a boat. You've got something you can use. And in the meantime, you've picked up a lot of skills that will apply to any boat building project down the road. So whichever method you decide to pursue for your next boat, you've got some skills built up. And you've got a little better handle on how long things will take.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
I think blued lapstrake plywood is an excellent method for a first boat, regardless of the size, because the materials are pretty readily available. When you build a traditional boat, you really need to know something about buying wood, which is a difficult subject.
Yeah.
It's not just something that you can go to the lumber yard and pick off the rack. Boat building lumber is not sold at lumber yards.
Yeah.
So that's a whole unknown and a difficult to learn thing for a lot of people. So it's good to start out with a plywood boat, I think, because that's a manufactured material. It's going to be the same and pretty uniform regardless of where you buy it. So that just takes one issue out of the whole equation that you have to worry about for your first boat.
Very cool. I like that. You know exactly what you're getting with plywood pretty much, don't you?
Well, not exactly. I mean, there are a lot of different plywoods.
Right.
But at least it's going to come 4 by 8 feet.
Yeah.
And you're going to be able to get it. There are a number of places around the country where you can get it. And when you can order it without seeing it and know pretty much what you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot say for regular wood. That takes some skill as far as ordering it.
Yeah.
Finding it.
So I'm just curious, Doug, are you using a Kumi 1088 quite a bit, I'm assuming, for these boats?
I don't use a Kumi.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
I do not, except in rare cases where we're really looking for the lightweight. A Kumi is not a rot-resistant species.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, they say, well, you coat it with epoxy and it'll be fine, but I'm skeptical of that.
Yeah.
In the long term, I think it's better to use a species that has more inherent rot resistance than a Kumi does. And so mostly what we use now is Meranti.
Oh, really?
Species.
Okay.
Yeah. It's relatively inexpensive. It's even less money than a Kumi.
Yeah.
And the panels the wood itself is much more open grain, and so it takes a little more work to get a nice smooth finish on it. But it's a strong wood, and it's manufactured. There's some good quality panels out there now that are pretty reasonable in price, and so we use a lot of that, and we've had good luck with it.
Now, is that built to British Standard 1088 also?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, very cool. So that's 20 or 30% heavier than a Kumi, something like that, you think, or do you know?
You dropped out there for a minute.
Oh, I'm just curious if that Meranti is maybe 30% heavier than a Kumi?
I doubt if it's quite that much.
Okay.
Maybe 20, 25%.
20 or 25%. Very cool.
We'll use the Akumi like on a laminated cabin top where we're trying to save weight, something up high, say the shelter top in a lobster boat, or any time where we really need to save weight. And if it's going to be sheathed and it's up out of the bilge water, then we'll use it there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very cool. Well, Doug, we're going to wrap it up here, but one thing I wanted to do before we close out is just have you tell us a little bit about your shop and what you guys do, and kind of give a little advertisement here and some contact information if one of our listeners is interested in what you guys are doing there.
Sure. Well, we have a building, a shop building, where we can build anything from a dinghy up to 60 feet, 65 feet actually. And we prefer traditional construction, but there are some designs where I recommend cold-molded or plywood construction. We do any of the sort of standardized wooden construction techniques. And we have, as you said, design capability. A lot of what we do these days is modifications of older designs or new boats to our own designs. But we also do a lot of restoration work. Right now we have an old Mauer-designed R boat in the shop that's getting a complete restoration. And we build power boats and sailboats, and pretty much that's it, I guess. And you can get in touch with us. Probably the easiest way is to look on our website, which is dhylanboats.com. That's DHYLANBOATS.com. Or you can just Google Doug Hylan. That's what will come up.
Okay.
And you can email us through that or find the phone. But there's a lot of pictures on there. There's a lot of... you can download free study plans for a lot of our designs. And you can get a pretty good idea of what we do from there.
Now, is there information on there about homesteading, Doug?
No, I've left those days behind.
Oh, really? Okay.
Although I still do keep a garden.
Okay, very cool. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Doug, and we'll continue this conversation after I turn off the recorder here. But thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, you're very welcome.
And then one other thing I usually ask at the end here is any other comments you'd like to make to the listeners?
Oh, go out and go boating.
Okay, very good. All right, well, thanks, Doug.
You're very welcome.
Okay.
Bye-bye now.
Bye. Doug, I really appreciate you being my first guinea pig for a phone interview. It came out great, and I really enjoyed talking to you. Learning more about the Herrschaft's and their history and some of the things they've done with their boats was really cool. Obviously, I've heard the name a lot, but didn't have a lot of details because I haven't really read about them or anything, but pretty fun to talk to somebody like yourself that really has a pretty good handle on who they were and what they did and has worked on some of their boats and uses some of their principles in building, so that's pretty sweet. So thanks, Doug, for doing that. Okay, I've got a request of my listeners. This is episode 87 of Hooked on Wooden Boats, which means in about 13 weeks we'll be having episode 100 of Hooked on Wooden Boats. I really do want to make it a special episode, do something a little bit different for episode 100 because it's a big milestone for me and for the community. And that's going to happen on about August 15th. So I would like to get your input on some ideas of what I could do for that episode. And the sky's the limit. If there's somebody you'd like to hear for an interview or other things you'd like me to do, I would appreciate your feedback. And you can send me an email, dan@hookedonwoodenboats.com, or if you have a computer with a microphone or on your smartphone, you could go to hookedonwoodenboats.com/voicemail. And you can leave up to a 90-second voicemail there from your computer or your smartphone. Or you can call me on my voicemail feedback hotline at 424-261-2360. I'd love to get your feedback. Please email or send me a message. Let me know what you'd like to see or hear on episode 100 of Hooked on Wooden Boats this August. Okay, kind of a long episode today, but I had a lot to say. I'm super stoked about some things. Can't wait to get going on the Scamp. Going to finish the canoe, get her in the water. Life is good, folks. If you're not in the wooden boat game, you got to get in. Seriously, get off the sidelines and start with something. Go rent a wooden canoe or go to a wooden boat school. Buy a wooden boat magazine. Go on the internet, search for wooden boats, listen to more of my podcasts, go to the Wooden Boat Festival near you. Do something to get in the wooden boat game. It's really a lot of fun. It's very rewarding, a lot of fun people, and it's a great hobby and pastime, and it gets you out on the water, which is really cool. So check it out and let me know how it goes. Okay, well, I guess that's about it for today, folks. I'm going to be continuing to tweak the website, make some other changes, so don't forget that each Thursday when I publish the podcast, I also write up some notes about the podcast on my website, and I publish some pictures related to the podcast, and there's an area for you to leave comments there, put in questions. So I would encourage you to check out the website. Also, please leave me a review on iTunes if you would. A 5-star review would be awesome. You can go to iTunes to the podcast section, search for Hooked on Wooden Boats, and leave a review there. And you can also subscribe to the podcast there, so it automatically gets delivered to your smartphone or your computer. Or you can subscribe from your phone using pod catching software, which on the iPhone would be like Podcasts, which is an Apple program that's free, or Pocket Cast, which costs $1.99. And there's also different podcatcher software available for the Android phone, so I would encourage you to check it out. Okay, well, thanks for sticking with me today. It's been a lot of fun as usual. We're going to keep rocking and rolling with Hooked on Wooden Boats. Keep the bright side up and the barnacled side down. Wooden Boat Dan over and out. Have a great week, and God bless.